When Russia invaded Ukraine, WORLDwrite volunteers hit the streets of London to film solidarity messages for Ukraine. But a lot of people didn't grasp what solidarity really meant, and many confused it with pity. To bring the idea to life, our crew decided to examine inspiring tales from UK history. Over 100 volunteers contributed, and this film's 10 chapters are the result.
Cotton lords, lords of creation.
In 1861, the US went to war. The southern states seceded from the Union after Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was an avowed enemy of slavery, a proponent of free labor. The Union imposed an embargo on the southern cotton exporting states.
The mill owners, they employed agitators to come and build a campaign in support of the Confederacy. And something clicked, really in a couple of guys' heads. There were two men. One was called Ted Hewson and the other was John Edwards. And the pair of them went to a meeting and they were addressed by a man called Joseph Barker, who was a boss's agent. And these two guys, they reacted against this bogus campaign. And so Hewson jumped up and said, wait. And he said, I want to amend the resolution. It shouldn't say, we, the workers of the town, support the Confederacy. It should say, we, the workers, support the Union. We want to support Lincoln and emancipation. And we don't want to support the slave owners. We want to support freedom. And by acclaim, everybody in the town said, yeah, that's right. They knew that the side of anti-slavery was right. But most of all, they had this great contempt for Barker and for the Liverpool merchants and for the mill owners who were trying to get them into this position. And it snowballed. And that was the beginning of a whole new campaign against slavery. It was called the Union Emancipation Society. The strange thing about Britain is they had abolished slavery. They liked the fact that Britain was the head of the anti-slavery movement in the world because it meant that they could stick it to the US. There were all these families who'd been involved in the anti-slavery campaign, and they included William Wilberforce, the Buxtons, Lord Brougham, who'd been the leader of what was called then the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. When the issue became an issue in America itself, in the Civil War, all of them flipped, and they became supporters of the Confederacy. I think probably the best way to understand it is their anti-Americanism overwhelmed their anti-slavery sentiment. William Wilberforce's son, Samuel Wilberforce, became the great champion of the Confederacy. The Manchester Guardian was militantly hostile to the Union. And I think in that sense they were really thinking about the mill owners, their friends, who they identified with. The Anti-Slavery Society itself organised meetings and published articles campaigning for the Confederacy. So when Hewson and Edwards demurred from this position, it was a strange thing to do in a sense because it was a step out of their immediate economic interests. All of this cotton, it was the foundation of hundreds of thousands of people's lives. This cotton spinning and weaving was the Industrial Revolution. It's the most important part of it. So all over the Northwest, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people whose lives depend on cotton. In Lancashire culture, there are a great many stories and songs of the cotton famine, different kinds of monuments and markers of the impact of the war and the poverty upon the cotton workers.
I'm on Cotton Famine Road on Ruley Moor in Rochdale. These stone sets, a third of a million of them, were laid by unemployed mill workers on a relief scheme. These mill workers were starving due to their support for a cotton embargo in opposition to slavery.
They were this war end.
Britain was actually considering participating in the war on the side of the Confederacy. They'd sent 2,000 troops to Canada ready to participate. The shipyards were making ships for the Confederacy. They made them with code names, so they were like C-105 when they crossed the Atlantic, and then they became the Shenandoah and things like that. But there were characters who didn't go along with this whole thing. And the important characters were Manchester Free Trade campaigner John Bright. There's a few of his statues in the northwest and in Manchester. Bright was the spokesman of free trade. Exiled from Germany in London, Karl Marx. Karl Marx had spent the 1850s writing his book about capital, which is about the mills. The whole book is about cotton. All these people were geared into action by this kind of upsurge. Weirdly, it was about a place perhaps more than 1,000 miles away. They had massive meetings in London, and there's a great moment where Marx's friends, knowing that he'd done a lot of the legwork, realising they've sold thousands of tickets, and they said, well, we should get Karl. Karl, you should speak. This is your moment. And he said, they want to hear me. He said that with my German accent, and they want to hear Bright. And his friends were surprised. They said, that capitalist, that free market capitalist, he said, well, he's right on this, isn't he? And he's popular. He can speak. Get Bright to do it. And Bright gave the speech. In the context of the war, the Americans, Lincoln, they did feel that they were isolated. So when the resolution came from the big meeting in Manchester, supportive of his policy, and they received the letters from the Union Emancipation in London, these letters arrived in the offices of Abraham Lincoln, who instructed his secretary to write a fulsome reply, which he did.
This statue of Abraham Lincoln serves as a reminder of the historic link between the US Civil War and the people of Manchester. In January 1863, he wrote a letter to the people of Manchester thanking them for their support, and this is the letter.
It's an important thing, and it means something. He makes this point that they made a noble sacrifice. He understood that it was a sacrifice, and that's the letter that goes out. It really meant something in America. The guy who was the editor of a big newspaper there organised this relief campaign. It was a strange thing to do in a way, given that they were in the middle of a war. But they knew that the cotton workers were suffering. They collected food, barrels of bacon, they put them on ships, and they sent them off for relief for the cotton workers. And you can still see in the Liverpool Museum, there's a barrel from the ship, and it was received with great hurrahs in Liverpool. Liverpool, very much a pro-slavery city, so it was quite an important thing.
And the Liverpool dock workers, every single one of them refused to take pay for handling those shipments.
It kind of touched them, that, and they could see themselves like players in history. And there's no surprise at all that in the aftermath of the American Civil War and the contest within Britain over what position to take on the Civil War, the skilled working men got the vote. There is this kind of mulish attempt to deny this story. People still find it harder to believe that working people were the ones who were anti-slavery. That's because it's the modern self-belief is that reactionary ideas come from impoverished people, desperate people who hate the other, and that kind of stuff. And they project what are already prejudices back onto history. And that what they hide is this workers' protest against slavery, even though it was acknowledged at the time by Gladstone, by Lincoln. Subsequently, it was kind of too awkward, and it got shuffled off, and it was embarrassing for Britain as a whole. Britain's self-image was not exactly burnished by the fact that they almost joined the war with the Confederacy, and certainly gave them assistance. It doesn't fit our modern day contemporary prejudices.
In
thing about the Lancashire cotton workers was they didn't put their self-interest first. They looked beyond. They did something which, on the face of things, was not in their self-interests. Maybe if they'd have just been led by hay like a horse, they would have supported the Confederacy. It would have been in their interests, you might think. Why not, support an independent Confederacy that could export cotton to Britain? That would keep the business going. But they didn't. They didn't think in that dull, immediate fashion about their immediate economic interests. They thought in a broader sense. They thought in larger moral terms. But they didn't forget themselves, but not selfishness for cash reward. For Hewson and Edwards, they wanted to resist, and they had a sense of themselves through the action of solidarity, that they became something, and that actually happened. The things that followed, the Trade Union Congress was founded shortly afterwards, the International Working Men's Association was founded shortly afterwards, and they took this very strident position. And in doing so, they became bigger, they became more, they became powerful people in their own right. They were respected, they stood up, and they were seen. They were seen by the President of the United States. They were seen by the Prime Minister of England. In doing so, they made themselves into real actors on the world stage.
Shouting loud from sea to sea, ours shall be the victory.
The story of the suffragettes and their militancy is rightly famous, and crucially won women the right to vote. But what role did men play? As Parliament was entirely male, clearly winning men to the fight for equality mattered. In 1907, Israel Zangwill, a member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, proclaimed, "We are suffragettes, suffragettes in trousers," giving men who acted in solidarity with the fight for women's right to vote a name. This is a glimpse of who they were. In 1866, MP John Stuart Mill suggested an amendment to the 1867 Reform Act to give votes to women. Although this first attempt proved unsuccessful, it introduced the argument for women's right to vote in the Commons. Later came MP Keir Hardie, who spoke at demonstrations and wrote leaflets in favour of female suffrage. Despite facing ridicule from his fellow MPs in the Commons, his commitment never wavered.
It is rarely discussed, but there were male politicians who took sides with women's fight for the vote. Perhaps none did as much as George Lansbury, MP for Bromley and Bow, whose memorial is here on Bow Road in East London.
On the 25th of June in 1912, he made a stand in opposition to the force-feeding of suffragettes on hunger strike. Famously, he rushed across the Commons floor, shaking his fists at Prime Minister Asquith and shouting, "You'll go down in history as the man who tortured innocent women, and you're beneath contempt." He demanded that all Labour MPs vote against all Liberal government proposals until women's suffrage was granted. And when this idea was rejected, in 1912 he resigned from the Labour Party, seeking re-election as an independent, pro-women's suffrage candidate. Whilst many early male sympathisers of women's suffrage were driven away by the WSPU's increased militancy, Lansbury justified the violence as necessary, leading to his arrest, having addressed a rally at the Albert Hall on the 26th of April 1913. He was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment at Pentonville Prison for incitement. But in solidarity with the suffragettes, he went on hunger strike. There was mass male support for women's suffrage in some areas among the working class. Sylvia Pankhurst, daughter of Emmeline, sought to expand the WSPU's, the Women's Social and Political Unions, focus to support universal suffrage.
It was here, at the site of what was Bow Palace, before it was demolished in 1960, that Sylvia Pankhurst held a great suffrage demonstration on the 24th of November in 1912. George Lansbury spoke to the crowd too, which included many working class men. Ironically, just across the street is a statue of William Gladstone, who opposed women getting the vote.
Sylvia, in fact, set up her own East London Federation of Suffragettes, which broke with her mother Emmeline's focus on upper-class women. Sylvia saw working-class women and men united as a more powerful force to win votes for women, one that would threaten the British elite rather than appeal for votes for ladies. She understood that a focus on winning the support of rich women might be fleeting, as they had every interest in supporting the status quo on broader social change. Sylvia saw women's fight for the right to vote as a class issue, and actively sought men's support.
And here, on the side of the Lord Morpeth pub, is this mural of her, painted by Jerome Davenport in 2018 to mark 100 years since some women got the vote.
As suffragette militancy intensified, men joined in solidarity. William Ball, for example, a member of the National Transport Workers' Federation, was sentenced to 2 months hard labour for breaking windows at the Home Office. Arthur Franklin was sentenced to 9 months in prison for setting fire to a railway carriage to protest the 1913 Cat and Mouse Act. Of course, we should never overestimate the solidarity suffragettes won from men. The suffragettes were lampooned, spat on and vilified, and the police force based here at Bow Road were a nightmare.
While men joined rallies and protests, it was here, at 31 Golden Square in Piccadilly Circus in central London, that William Garrard set up a dojo on the site of the former School of Japanese Self-Defence.
After seeing the violence which suffragettes experienced in 1910 at the hands of the police and male bystanders in what later became known as Black Friday, William Garrard, along with his wife Edith, began teaching women the martial art of jiu-jitsu in this dojo. His intention was to teach this form of self-defence, to allow suffragette protesters to better protect themselves. William Garrard regularly dressed as a police officer, allowing his wife to demonstrate the jiu-jitsu techniques which suffragettes could use on him. As a result of their efforts, the term suffragitsu became popular. It is also said that he hid weapons used by the suffragettes under his dojo's floorboards. Another example of Garrard's desire to support a cause that did not directly affect him. An impressive and little-known example of solidarity.
Between 1936 and 39, from all over the globe, a total we think of around 35,000 volunteers went to volunteer for the Spanish Republic. 2,500 went from the UK. Of that, 550 were killed, and the remainder, nearly every one of them, was wounded. Initially, people just went before there was even any kind of organised battalions to join. People went as individuals. The International Brigades, and I have here a replica of an International Brigade banner. It was a programme initiated by the Soviet Union. There were other organisations that people from Britain joined. The POOM had a militia, and the POOM was an abbreviation for what is in English a Marxist Party of Unification. They were called at the time by many communists as a Trotskyist organisation. They weren't really, but they were certainly not affiliated to the Communist Party. The other militia, which was really significant at that time, was an anarchist militia called the CNT. So they were genuine working class organisations.
Michael, what do you think that motivated these young people to go and fight in Spain, knowing that they may die?
They are told that they may not return. And I had interviewed nearly 30 years ago, a number of volunteers who went, when some of them were teenagers when they went. And I remember one of them, Benny Goldman, telling me that he was told that when he went to the Communist Party district office in Manchester, you realise there's every chance you won't be coming back. And Benny was already involved in street battles with fascists in Britain. And he said to me that he didn't feel it was enough. There's conversations amongst his friends, his comrades. Are you going? Are you going? Let's go. And he left work one afternoon and made his way to London, and then over to Paris, down to the south of France, and then walked into Spain. He wrote, after he'd been there a couple of weeks, to tell his parents where he was. Benny's 18. And Benny went in the January of 1937, and he was waist deep in snow going across the Pyrenees, wearing the clothes that he'd turned up to work in an upholstery factory in Manchester on a Friday. By 6 weeks later, the British were involved for the first time in a huge battle called the Battle of Jarama, and lose something like 200 men on the first day. And that news comes back. It's a huge shock. But what happens? Even more people volunteer. And an overwhelming proportion of people that went to Spain from Britain were Jewish.
My father was Jewish. He went from the Jewish East End. He went out at the end of 1937 at the age of 20. He wasn't actually in the field in Spain very long because he was captured and he was therefore in prison on his 21st birthday. He was in prison for nearly a year in San Pedro, which was essentially a concentration camp. The prisoners in San Pedro were starved, frozen, beaten, and because he was Jewish, they were subjected to particularly harsh treatment. He was so young when he went out. He was barely 22 when he came back to England. And that experience and the relationships that were forged in Spain stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Order of the world came sailing, the 15th International Brigade.
Major Sam Mild, as he became. I know his son, Mike, and has told me a great deal. He was wounded on 4 occasions, if not 5 occasions. And he was decorated by the Republican government and given the Spanish Medal of Valor. The Russians described him, his nickname was the English Lion. He was so brave, he was so courageous, and would never ask a soldier to do anything that he wouldn't do, and he put himself in harm's way a lot. He became the final British battalion commander. For the remainder of his life, he ran the Veterans Association, which was looking after British veterans who'd fought in Spain. The British battalion was part of the 15th Brigade, which was an English-speaking brigade. Language can become, if you like, a liability in combat. The problems of understanding orders.
My partner, David Marshall, was in the International Brigade. He went to Spain. David was a lot older than me, but he went when he was 20. He was a civil servant working in the Dole office in Middlesbrough, and it was the time of the Great Depression. And one day he bought the Times, and there was a short paragraph about what was happening in Spain and about the way the elected Republican government, who'd been elected by all the people, was in danger of being overthrown. And so he thought, well, the working class people have voted this government in, and this is what should happen in all countries, that people should have a say in what's going on in their lives. And that's what moved him to go. And he thought, well, if there's going to be a fight, I'm going to be part of it. And he just said he was going on his holidays and told his parents he was going to stay with his girlfriend, told his girlfriend that he was going hiking with his friend. And he saved some money from his salary and off he went. And he got to the borders of Spain and France, and they wouldn't let him in because he had no papers to say he belonged to a left-wing organisation. So with his last bits of money, he was sitting in a cafe looking miserable, and this chap came over to him and he said, "Hello, how are you?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I came to fight for the Spanish bloody Republic and they wouldn't let me in." And the man said, "Oh, come on, I'll get you in," and they asked him questions. But anyway, this chap took him over to them and said, "Look, he's an Englishman, young Englishman. He doesn't have any papers. He's, if he was going to be a spy or a narc, he would have every paper that he needed to get in. So obviously he's a fighter who wants to fight for Republican Spain. So they let him in, and off they went to Barcelona. And there's a very famous picture of him and several others, and he's holding a banner, and he's got his shorts on and his glasses, and totally unprepared for war, really. But he was wounded quite early on, and they sent him back to England. And I think he was very lucky in that, because if the international brigades were formed then, and there were more hospitals, he'd have been patched up and sent back into battle again. And he couldn't walk, he was unable to walk at the time. So they sent him home. He became a communist as well. Spain was a great time in their lives. They went to fight for something that they knew was right.
There is an incredible mystique about the international brigades, but on the other hand, these are people who have never fired a gun. In the training, they didn't have enough ammunition and they didn't have enough rifles. They were poorly equipped. So they're not experienced soldiers, they've not been properly trained, they don't speak the same language as other people around them, and they're used as a kind of shock troops at the vanguard. They're thrown right in. There are cases in which Pollitt writes to a family in Glasgow, somewhere to say, your son, the standard letter, your son died in combat, and a letter is written back. That's funny, because he's upstairs at the moment. You know, he's been here for 2 weeks. Some people did desert. And what do you do? What do you do to deserters in a volunteer army? They didn't execute them. Most people were just given jobs, basically dealing with latrines or something. Was their military contribution significant? I think so, yes. The Jarama Valley was important to Franco because he was trying to encircle Madrid. There is a highway that runs from down the Jarama Valley that connects Madrid to Valencia. And the Spanish government had moved the seat of the government from Madrid in central Spain to Valencia because they were frightened that Madrid might fall. Although the International Brigade took heavy casualties, they held the road right until the end of the war. Prior to that, in November of 36, there was the siege of Madrid. There were at Madrid around 90,000 armed militia, trade unionists, anarchists, socialists, communists, ordinary people, ordinary Spaniards, and they see off Franco's forces, and they are right at the gate, and their numbers are crumbling, and then suddenly in come International Brigade volunteers from Britain and from France and elsewhere in Germany. They did make a difference militarily at certain battles. They also, I would think, in terms of lifting morale, so that the Spanish people know that they have support and friends all around the world. You know, in terms of changing things in Britain, look, I mean, it changed me. And I was born in 1959 and maybe really interested in history. And, you know, I describe it in my book as a beacon of what people are prepared to sacrifice for a cause in another country because they see those people as their kind of brothers and sisters. Back in the UK, there was an Aid for Spain campaign, which was about sending clothes, powdered milk, food, powdered eggs, money. Collections were made just on the back of a handcart. Plays were written to raise money. Orchestras did all kinds of things. It was a huge movement. There was enormous sympathy for Spain, and people felt, you know, why isn't our government doing more? Why, you know, because the Spanish government was not allowed to buy arms on the open market. And it began to politicise people and let them know what fascism was.
Jimmy Rutherford from Edinburgh. Jimmy was a young lad. He was a teenager. He volunteered, he went over to Spain. He was captured, was put in a prisoner of war camp, was then exchanged later that year for Italian fascists who'd been captured by the Spanish Republican side. He went back to Edinburgh, but then he came back out again. And he'd signed an agreement when he was released that he wouldn't come back and fight. He came back out, he fought, he was captured again. And one of the people that had captured him the first time recognised him. So he was taken out and he was shot. He was executed because of his beliefs. And we're currently trying to get a memorial put up in a little place called Newhaven just outside Edinburgh, where he was from, to remember him and to remember his sacrifice.
So what was the response of the British government to people who went to fight?
Initially, they turned a blind eye to it. Then they leaned on something called the Foreign Enlistment Act, in which they made it illegal. Spain was radicalising people.
So how do you think this is a good example of solidarity?
Well, it's pretty extreme. I mean, everyone who finds out about this story asks themselves, oh, could I have done that? Would I have travelled to a foreign country knowing the chances of being injured or killed are so high, against the express wishes of my government? The International Brigade stands out as a shining example, and the reason why still people remember, they're all gone now, but still people come to remember them and to take this story forward to new generations of young people who might say, well, the world's a messed up place and there's nothing I can do and it's all rigged and, you know, what's the point of anything? Well, look at these people. They knew there was a point to taking action, putting their lives and livelihoods at risk and for something they knew to be right.
All for one, one for all. Sounds very corny, but that's what, for me, what internationalism is.
We're here at Bamber Bridge in Preston in Lancashire to find out more about the racial violence which took place on the night of June 24th, 1943, which saw black American GI Private William Crosland shot dead.
And this memorial stands outside the old Hob Inn, where the conflict started.
What was Bamber like in 1943?
It was a very typical small Lancashire town, pretty working class and very homogeneously white.
Well, the principal industry was cotton and engineering.
It wasn't known as being a particularly kind of a revolutionary, radical place. Nothing. It's a kind of place where nothing really happened.
This was where black GIs were based in 1943, on Munsey Road in Bamber Bridge.
We're 750,000 up at Adams Hall, just up the road. At this point in American history, the army is still segregated.
Have you come to my Birmingham, you must come to my home and have a cup of tea with me, both of you.
Thank you, we will.
Goodbye and good luck.
Goodbye. Bye-bye. Now look, men, you heard that conversation. That's not unusual here. It's the sort of thing that happens quite a lot. Now let's be frank about it. There are colored soldiers as well as white here, and there are less social restrictions in this country. Just what you heard, an English woman asking a colored boy to tea. She was polite about it, and he was polite about it. Now, look, that might not happen at home, but the point is, we're not at home.
The African Americans in the army, they're not allowed to fight. They're there to clean the latrines, to cook the food, to do transport. They're not there to fight. That's for elite white soldiers.
Blacks should be used only in service units. Blacks should not command whites.
They are kept separate, and the British government played along with it. They're used to being treated really poorly, and yet white civilians in general are treating them really well.
The reception was such that there is evidence of black GIs being invited home for Sunday lunch, Sunday dinners with white families in Bamber Bridge, etc. There's recorded evidence that the residents were saying, well, these are people just like us. They're suffering similar hardship to us as working class people. We will stand alongside and support them. There was some resentment towards white GIs when they came to Britain. They were seen as a bit brash, a bit arrogant, you know. They also
earned a lot more money than British people, and so that attracted British women. There was a phrase, oversexed, overpaid, and over here, so that kind of summed up how the American soldiers were seen, but that was not extended to African Americans. George Orwell said that African American soldiers were the only American soldiers who had any manners.
Yeah, and we just have to look at what happens in this very pub. Here we are in the Hop Inn. The local barmaid, Gillian Vasey, she talks about this place being a home for those black soldiers and then being able to drink here and having very convivial relationships with local civilians and also white British soldiers that are on leave. She says that certain white troops would come in here, though, and be quite resentful about that. So, for instance, when she's trying to serve someone at the bar, she serves them in order. And she says that the white troops tried to push in, the white American troops, and they tried to, it's my prerogative, it's my right, and I always get served first. And they said, no, you get back to the back of the queue. We're in Britain now, and we don't have those rules here.
Yeah.
In this very pub in 1943.
The attitude that was taken by the residents of Bamber Bridge against the wishes of the American military and with the support of the British government, that this is our town, they've done nothing to us, we're fighting the same war against in Europe, and until they mess up, we'll treat them just the same as we would treat our neighbour.
Black troops all over the country had relationships with locals. And white British women are saying, they're just changing my life. I'm suddenly dancing in different ways I've never danced before. At the same time as causing lots of excitement and interest, again, the racism is there from the American military, who think that this is undermining morale. Anti-miscegenation laws exist still in the 1940s in many states in the American South. So you're not allowed to marry outside your race.
In fact, within the military, if you wanted to marry, you had to get your commander's permission. And that's why some of these relationships were clandestine relationships, because the black GIs knew very well that no matter how much the two parties were wrapped up in each other, he was unlikely to get clearance from his commanding officer.
There were 3 pubs, I think, here that put up Black Troops
Welcome.
Black Troops Welcome.
Yeah, those kinds of signs went up all over the country because of the attitude of the military police. That the landlords were saying, well, actually, no, these people are okay. What happened that evening? The pub here is coming up to closing down time, and there's a very mixed clientele, and they're all just kind of having a normal raucous end of the pub time. But that closing time, raucous time, is not seen as acceptable by the military police. That night, reports come that there's a disturbance in the Hop Inn. Or maybe it's almost a made-up thing by the military police. They're basically on the lookout for blacks causing trouble. So they come here, they see that one of the troops, Eugene Nunn, is not wearing the correct uniform for being out in the town. And so they try to arrest him. Now, at that moment, all hell breaks loose because everyone else, the black troops, see this as unfair, and they stop the arrest. And then the white civilians in the pub join in to help them stop the arrest. And there's a kind of a mayhem. In the midst of all this, one of the white British troops in the pub shouts out, "What are you doing arresting them? They're doing nothing wrong." And that's documented in the court-martial records. The military police are kind of pushed out of the pub. And as they're pushed out of the pub, they shout out to the black troops, "We'll be back for you." And the black troops start walking home. And behind them, there are 4 or 5 ATS girls. There's girls in uniform, women in uniform. I think that's kind of important because when the American military police come back with reinforcements, they're not just looking at those black troops, they're looking at the fact that they're interrelating with white women. That is the greatest taboo in the American segregationist terms. Anyway, they do come back, and there's a few more of them, and they stop and try to make the arrest again. And a more significant melee happens on the streets. So about 500 yards down from the pub on the way back to the base. At one point, because the American military police are armed, I think it's Eugene Nunn who tries to get hold of one of the American military police's weapons. Then other military police start not only using their beliefs, also weapons are fired. And there is a melee which leads to injuries. But again, the black troops fight them off, and they get back in their van and they drive on. So there's been 2 fights now. There's now walking wounded. So anyway, they decide to go back to their camp to rally their fellow soldiers because they feel certain the military police are going to come back to arrest them. Certain of the black troops make the decision to open the armoury for their own self-defence.
To break in.
To break into the armoury, yeah.
They broke in. They wouldn't have had that's for the officers, and the officers weren't giving away those keys. So, in fact, you have a rebellion against Jim Crow segregation happening at this moment. But for the American military, it's a mutiny against military authority, which is one of the most serious charges you can have against your troops. So anyway, there is this mayhem going on. At that moment, I think it's 4 military police vans, one with a machine gun on top of it, burst their way into the camp through the gates.
It's actually described as an improvised armoured vehicle, so they put some sort of shielding around to stop incoming fire. Word is spread amongst the camp that the white military are just out to kill black folk, full stop, irrespective of whether you're involved or not. So that then just further enrages, inflames it all.
And now the incident spreads because many of the troops, rather than staying in the camp to be mown down as they see it, start dispersing with their weapons into the town.
It's also recorded that black troops came back, when they came out onto the streets, they were telling the residents to stay indoors because there's going to be a fight. Such is the relationship that they have with the locals that they don't necessarily want to see any come to harm.
There are numerous firefights, and in one of the firefights, Private William Crossland gets shot dead. There will be 2 court-martial trials about the mutiny of the black troops. As far as we can tell, although it might be under the American Official Secrets Act, there was no investigation into who killed Private William Crossland.
The thing to remember about this this evidence is that 2 things. One, it happened in wartime, so all sides were editing the information that came out and picking and choosing which bits they released. And the second one was most of the information originates in the hands of the Americans, who want to paint themselves in a negative light. In that 5-hour patch, it's only by the grace of God that we only had 1 fatality, and supposedly these 7.
And we're really lucky there are no civilian casualties.
When the morning came around, certainly in one house, the military police turned up, and then somehow they'd worked out that bullets had gone through front door. Came in, removed the bullets, and the perception is that they're going to see and make sure everybody's all right in the house. All they were doing, collecting evidence to get rid of it.
On the day or 2 afterwards, the report was just 5 or 6 lines long because military censorship doesn't want this bad news getting out there.
Within the British government of the day, they didn't actually want black soldiers in this country.
Yeah.
It's actually recorded, so it's not just some sort of emotional outburst I'm going through. It's there for Joe public to read. And all this precedes What we now come to look at the start of the Race Relations Law and equalities by a good 20 years. How advanced were the residents of Banbury Bridge? That's why we can never give enough credit to the stance that they took, supporting these. In fact, they were referred to as the same as us, fellow workers, working class, same as us. So that stance can never, ever be allowed to gather dust. It's a lesson about acceptance and recognising what we have in common rather than highlighting to separate the differences that we have, because we have more in common than we have differences. And I'm going to credit the people at Banbury Bridge is recognising that.
These black troops were being treated like human beings, and that's a big lesson they took home with them. And that's the other side of this. They took that lesson home with them.
The Briggers had a conscience, and they treat people as people. You don't need a big complicated formula for solidarity. Conscience, reasoning, and an open mind.
And I think that's really interesting to me, is the solidarity comes out of a moral compass. It comes out of a humanism. And that develops through your relationships with other human beings.
I think any discussion of solidarity has to involve asking people to fight for causes and principles that aren't directly their own, that don't directly affect them. You would not have equal rights for women if women had just been left to fight for them on their own. You would have just had this ongoing, oh, calm down, dear, the girls are just doing that. Nothing would have changed, because the whole reason why women had to fight for rights was that the world was run by men. So it's been vitally important in any of the big wins that men have fought for this cause or something that they think is just and right.
Nowadays, we've got so used to the stay in your lane idea that it becomes almost impossible for people to imagine that men could support women in a joint struggle. But I actually think it's fundamental for any kind of struggle, to be focused on all people together. I mean, it's a very luxurious type of politics, it seems to me, where you can start turning away potential supporters.
Well, the history of campaigns for abortion rights is littered with completely inspiring women and men. In this country, the campaign through the 20th century was called the Abortion Law Reform Association, which began back in the 1920s, but the modern history of it is through the 60s. So it was the campaign that worked to bring into being the 1967 Abortion Act, which now people recognise had its limits. But if you look at the individuals that are involved in that campaign, they are completely inspiring people. David Paynton, sadly died a few years ago, but he was one of a number of male doctors, actually, who played an absolutely critical role in both the politics and the practice of abortion rights. So he trained as a doctor and completely moved from being against abortion to an absolutely dedicated campaigner for abortion rights and provider of abortion. Sacrificed enormously in his own career because of this. He never got promoted to a professor, and he did as much as anybody actually in this country as a man and as a doctor to make abortion available to women, trained up other doctors. That's what he dedicated his life to doing. I mean, the thing about abortion is that clearly the experience is different for men. Men don't get pregnant. Men aren't going to have to confront this in their lives in that very practical way. But that doesn't necessarily take you anywhere in terms of the arguments you might make, how you might see the issues, how you might articulate them, how you might convince other people, how you might make the case. If you talk to any abortion provider, they will tell you that there's plenty of women who have become pregnant and availed themselves of their services who will make it clear that they definitely don't think that they're like the other women having abortion. They think that their case is a good case, and then there's these other women who have abortions where the case isn't a good case. So the simple fact of womanhood And the fact that you have reproductive biology which may lead you into a situation where you have an unwanted pregnancy that for whatever reason you have to deal with, doesn't necessarily take you to a place of a proper understanding of the issues and solidarity with other women. We also know that many women get involved in the other side. Movements against abortion are populated and oftentimes led by women. So my point here is that there's no inevitable correlation between the fact of needing an abortion and being somebody who can make the case for one. Personal is really not political in that kind of direct sense. The experiences that we have can leave us off in all sorts of directions in the sense of what we might think about it politically.
I have to say, I don't think any of my ideas come from my uterus. I mean, I think my ideas come from my brain and my engagement with other people through reading books, through conversations. So this kind of notion that our bodies, kind of if you don't have the right body, then you can't express a particular idea. I think we need to really call that out as just rubbish.
If you look at the political sphere and people who have made the case for abortion rights in the British Parliament, that is most certainly not something which is specific to female politicians. You will find female politicians who are committedly opposed to abortion. And of course it's their right to see it that way and make that argument. There are men who have made the case brilliantly.
Do you believe it's important in your view for men to support women's right to choose?
Absolutely. Abortion is an issue for everybody.
Why do you think it's important for men to support women's right to abortion?
Well, I think women should be in control of their own bodies, shouldn't be put upon by men.
It's everyone's right to have autonomy over themselves.
Those of us who want the case to be made absolutely need to recognise the solidarity that they're offering to women, but it's not a kind of, oh, I'm feeling your pain. It's a proper argument, a substantive argument about freedom and the freedom that all individuals need. And there's many men who articulate that brilliantly, just as there are women who articulate it brilliantly. You know, if women are going to become freer in their lives, and be in a different position still to the one that we have now, which is a lot better than it used to be, we need to change the objective situation that we find ourselves in. You know, we need to decriminalise abortion. We need to gain better facilities. There needs to be more money spent on the provision of abortion. Those aren't questions of identity or feeling. You know, they're objective characteristics of the society, and we need to work out how we're going to make pressure for change.
1976 to 1978, a bunch of South Asian women, led by Jay Ben Desai, went on strike at a film processing unit out in Dulles Hill.
Now the site of two apartment blocks, the infamous Grunwick strike took place here in what was formerly the Grunwick Film Processing Laboratories in Chapter Road, Dulles Hill, in the London Borough of Willesden.
The mainly female Asian migrant workers, dubbed strikers in saris by the media, suffered intolerable conditions, were paid less than the average wage of the time, and they were denied the right to join a trade union.
And initially the strike was about intolerable working conditions. People having to ask the manager or the foreman or whatever, can I go to the toilet? A big glass box in the top of the building, sort of a kind of panopticon affair where everybody's under surveillance. Very poor wages. And as it so happened, 1976 was the hottest year on record, which didn't add to the comfort of working people. And they joined a union called Apex as the only union available. And the company that they worked for, the Grunwick Film Processing Company, refused to recognise the union. And as a result of that, the struggle escalated into something much bigger than just a bunch of women seeking to improve their working conditions.
One of the key things less commented upon, which we can learn from this historic battle, is that the level of support and solidarity the women received, they won themselves.
They spoke and argued at 1,000 meetings. They threatened the trade union leadership and stood up to the employers, the police and the courts. They inspired people not to feel pity for them, but to take their side.
In countries also, we went Norway, we went Europe, we went all England, in the Scotland, Ireland, you name it. Our delegates was everywhere spreading the issue.
The struggle spread, and it shows you that within working class people's lives, the instinct is to have solidarity with each other. When it became clear that the reaction of the company, which wouldn't recognise the union, and other workers like the postal workers, because the film processing industry relied heavily, they processed the films and they posted them out to people. So if you couldn't get your films posted out to whoever had sent them in for processing, then the business was grinding to a halt. So with the postal workers coming out in solidarity, it was putting tremendous pressure on the company. And it spread beyond that as well, but that's an example of the solidarity that was there.
This 28-metre long mural on Dudden Hill Lane depicts the extraordinary solidarity won by these brave Asian women. At a mass picket in June 1977, over 20,000 people turned up to show their support, including hundreds of dockers, steelworkers and miners.
Chapter Road was filled with police who were there to protect the employers and help bus loads of replacement scrap labour through the gates.
Set-tos with the police ensued, and the defiance of Jayaban Desai and her fellow workers when confronted with all the state could throw at them is today legendary.
But the leadership of the trade union movement intervened and effectively undermined what the women were doing, as did the Trade Union Congress. And Jayaban Desai and some other women went outside the Trade Union Congress in 1977, I think, and went on hunger strike outside the Trade Union Conference. But it was a graphic example of how working people react to the conditions of their existence and the failures of those who represent them to be able to sort of guide them and help them in the course of realizing something. And that willingness to step up is always limited by those who surrounded with, countervailing arguments about what you can and can't do, what's within the law, what's not within the law. And trade union leaders act to defend the union more than they act to defend their members.
Do you think it's possible that the Grunwick strikes attracted so much support because the movement originated from the actual workers and not a union?
Absolutely, yes. The government organised what was called a Scarman report to investigate the conditions, and the Scarman report said the company should recognise the union, but they didn't. And I think the working conditions improved a bit because the company was embarrassed by the fact that it got so much publicity about what a shitty company they were, basically. The trade union movement has always been able to win something. Otherwise, who would pay £15 a month into it? Or who would, down through the years, pay dues into it? So, clearly, obviously, its existence depends upon its ability to be able to gain something for working people. But in my book, that's very limited.
Although it ended in defeat, Grunwick is remembered for the way in which thousands of workers, men and women, black and white, came together to defend the rights of migrant women workers.
This was a period in which racism was rampant, but as Jayaban Desai said, we have shown that white workers will support us.
The 70s and Enoch Powell, rivers of blood because of race relations in Britain and because of immigrants pouring into the country. And yet here were these Asian women who, tens of thousands of ordinary working class people in Britain turned out to support. Ordinary people will quite willingly sort of step up regardless of whose rights they're asked to defend, because their instinct is to say, well, that could be me.
I think things went downhill in the 80s because of the AIDS panic. It was the promotion of fear, the idea of a gay plague, and this wasn't helped by gay rights activists who, along with the government, tried to counter the idea of it being a gay plague by saying, oh, everyone is at risk, as though that will mean nobody's going to be anti-gay. But it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, it was activists in collaboration with the government who put out the famous Tombstone advert with John Hurt's voice, which, you know, was this fear and horror of this pandemic that's going to kill us all.
But it's spreading. So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you.
Even swimming pools were closed. It was that mad. Pensioners were examining their sexual history, even though they might be in their 80s. And this leaflet went through absolutely everybody's letterbox, promoting this message that we could all die. Don Milligan and Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick wrote a really good pamphlet at the time called The Truth About the AIDS Panic, you know, and it said HIV is hard to get, not everyone is going to die. So it told the truth and it championed lesbian and gay rights. The pamphlet was written off as some sort of homophobic treatise, because if you didn't go along with the sort of prevailing line, you must be some anti-gay moron, which was obviously ridiculous.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
Section 28 made it a criminal offence to positively promote homosexuality in schools. Lots of straight people were very sympathetic to the cause of equal rights, were on the side of overthrowing this reactionary piece of legislation. I did stand in the general election, but that was in 1987. That was on a lesbian and gay rights platform and got into all sorts of trouble for that and rows. But it was a, you know, a good thing to do, even though I only got a few hundred votes, it was still worth doing. When this Section 28 was going through the House of Commons, I did some research and I found these new slides for sex education in schools, and they were hilarious. And so every image that showed a penis, in the bottom of the image was a hand with a ring on it. You had to show it in the context of love and marriage, or you could be inadvertently promoting homosexuality. It was completely insane. Anyway, we were into doing sort of political street theatre and challenging this rubbish. And so in the middle of Dortmund Square in Leeds, I'd got a big flip chart and was telling an assembled crowd about Section 28 and why it was backward. And I'd drawn a great big penis, quite badly, just, you know, like that, and a hand with a ring on it. And I was very quickly dragged off by each arm, you know, like this, by the police, and threatened with prosecution under some obscenity law.
Thinking way back to the mid-1980s when I was a lot younger, one of the things that had a big effect on me was something that probably people wouldn't have heard of, which was something called the One Born 12 campaign, which was a group of gay men who were arrested for the heinous crime of objecting to a counsellor who said they should have been gassed. Really, really awful homophobic statement. And these gay men were arrested and held, I think, for over a week. We protested against that. I think it was really, really important for straight men and everybody basically to support people like the One Born 12. It may not have been directly my issue, but it was a question of people's rights. And I think that rights should, you know, are universal. The rights that they were denied are rights that I expect. And if I allow their rights to be diminished, I think it also makes it far more difficult for me to defend my rights or others' rights in other contexts as well.
The British Gay Liberation Front was founded in the London School of Economics in 1970. We were in the Socialist Society at Lancaster University, and the amazing thing was that a fair number of people in the Socialist Society, particularly the men, were gay men, and we didn't know this about each other at all. Initially, we didn't want to do anything as radical as call ourselves the Liberation Front. We thought that was a bit extreme. But this rather annoying lesbian came up from London, and she was sitting in this meeting in somebody's kitchen, and she started banging on the table, saying that we've got to say that we're proud and we're angry. But in fact, of course, she was entirely right. I suppose about a week after that, we decided to call ourselves the Liberation Front, and caused lots of mayhem after. When I came out, I was the organiser of the International Socialists, which was the forerunner of the Socialist Workers' Party. The comrades then, when I came out, said it would be all right if I came out as long as I took a back seat. And then another comrade, a male comrade, said to me, "I don't know why you don't throw yourself in the river." So there was all that side to it. But on the other hand, there were positive responses from straight people about the place. And that has a long history. In the late 19th century, 1897, I think, Havelock Ellis was a psychoanalyst who was the first person to publish works on homosexuality in English, who was a straight man, did lots of work with other people to develop the case and a new understanding of homosexuality, which you and I would regard as completely bizarre now, but nevertheless it was progressive at the time. The whole question of the way in which people related to all that was completely uneven. The International Socialists at the time were completely hostile, really. They're anti-gay. One of the things that most annoyed the International Socialists was I arranged lots of meetings with male trade unionists, with shop stewards and so on, up and down the country that went very, very well. There I was in my Afghan coat with hair down the back of my shirt and a shoulder bag and earrings in both ears. And this completely horrified the leadership. But I got on fine with the workers. I remember working in a place that was where the employers were all observant Muslims. And this guy was trying to say that I shouldn't work there because a fellow workmate, I shouldn't work there because I was homosexual. And the management called me in for a meeting with this anti-gay guy and wanted us to have a conversation with each other. And I refused. I said, I'm not having a discussion with him or with anyone about this. So I said, I don't care what he thinks, right? Right. I mean, you can sack me or do what you like, but actually I'm not going to apologise for who I am or what I'm doing, and he's got no right. It's not a mutual exchange here. We're not misunderstanding each other. He doesn't like the fact that I'm homosexual. Well, that's his problem, right? I mean, and that's the way in which you should deal with problems in the workplace. I published a pamphlet called The Politics of Homosexuality, but that only saw the light of day because Sheila Rowbottom, a straight woman, paid for it. And one or two other intellectuals from around the International Socialists helped me. And there were these evil characters at this branch meeting where they had a little trial of me in a kitchen where they explained to me that I had to stop doing gay work because it was not in the interests of the party. So I had to part company with that organisation at that time. They were anti-gay, really. I mean, and there are still people that are anti-gay, but you can hear left-wing people talking, and you would think that it was the left that brought about gay liberation. And I assure you that is absolutely not the case. They were always running behind, because of course the modern struggle to improve the situation of gay people was brought about by the Moral Welfare Council of the Church of England in 1953, who actually got the whole debate going and led to the Wolfenden Committee that reported in 1957, and then 10 years later in 1967 they did the partial decriminalisation, which legalised what nobody ever got caught for, which was adult men in private over 21. In private didn't mean a hotel room, it meant private. In fact, prosecutions increased after they passed that law, but nevertheless it was an opening up of the whole debate. But the most important thing, and this is causes some dispute because of the confusions of identity politics nowadays, but the whole question was equality. The whole question is we wanted equal rights. We wanted to have the same rights as everybody else in society. And that was the case that was made. The whole way in which people talk about these things now is entirely different. You know, when they talk about identity politics, they're talking about themselves, they're talking about individuals. Modern identity politics is about subjective feelings. The projection of that into some kind of social position, apparently political position, is nonsense, because you just have to agree with it. You know, if you say this is how I feel, I say, oh really, you know, okay, but that's how you feel. There's nothing you can do about that, because it doesn't connect you with other people. Once the marriage thing went through, then we had equal rights right across the board. And I think this has led to real confusion in the minds of people like Stonewall and all the rest of it, which is one of the reasons why they've opted to go down the trans route. They didn't have anything else to do. That's why I think the gay movement should have directed its main thrust towards international work. If you struggle for equality and you get it, well then you've got it. And you've got adoption of children, you've got the settling down into monogamous relationships and coupledom and all the rest of it. And the difficulty of integration in the society is reconfigured by equality, which people didn't really anticipate. People never get what they fought for, they always get something else. You know, because of course, you know, people didn't want regular family life and didn't want to gay relationships to become straight ones, but that's what they've become. Right. So the radical rhetoric of the early 70s has become something, has just vanished in the mists of time.
Workers Against Racism was an organisation that we set up because in the 80s the issue of racism was being used to divide the working class. Racism was a very big thing then. It's quite difficult for people now to understand how different Britain was then.
You know, all these skinheads, you know, they swearing, shouting and throw these stones, break my all windows. And all of a sudden one is coming here, I break my teeth in here, there's the break.
Physical attacks on black people was a very real thing, particularly here in the east of London.
The National Front is white men's front! Join the National Front!
There were many more direct instances. I think probably the most important aspect of racism that was there in the 80s was that there was, I would argue, more significant official, if not overt support, than tacit turning the other way for policies, official policies, particularly around immigration.
The core element of our campaign was against immigration controls, and the reason why we were opposed to immigration controls was that it was through immigration controls that racism was being institutionalized in British society, because what it established in the popular mind was that there was a connection between the problems of Britain and the number of immigrants that there were in the country. In other words, black people were being blamed for unemployment, were being blamed for problems with the health service, with lack of housing. And for us that was very problematic because, of course, the problems of Britain couldn't be put down to black people. It was down to the crises of the capitalist system, of the social, political, cultural problems that Britain had. This was a way of basically covering the real problem.
So who was George Ruku?
George Ruku was a guy from the Seychelles who had come to Britain in 1975. When we met him, he was a shop steward in UCAT, in the direct works in Manchester City Council. And he had come to Britain in 75, I think it was. And he was a British citizen because the Seychelles was part of the Commonwealth at that point. What happened was he had to submit his passport to the Home Office because it had run out. And essentially what happened was that they lost it. He was instructed that he had to go to the Seychelles Embassy to get a renewal of his passport, or a new passport. And by the time that this came to that, they were no longer part of the Commonwealth. So it was very, very complicated. So to cut a long bureaucratic story short, essentially they accused George of being an overstayer, that he was illegally in the country, and they threatened to deport him. It was very interesting because when we began to get involved, the other people who were involved, stressed the whole time, George is a trade unionist, George is a trade unionist. And we said, yes, he's a trade unionist, but if you want to defend him and get other people to support him, in other words, if you want to build real solidarity with George, not just sympathy, then you've got to confront the issue of race. You've got to confront racism because that's the core issue here. He's being deported because he's black, but not because he's a trade unionist, not because he's a shop steward. And if we're going to win his fellow workers to this, we have to confront that. They were very reluctant to do this, and I'll tell you why. Because the Direct Works Department in the Manchester City Council, which I think was very similar to other direct works departments, was quite renowned for being quite racist. There were not many black people working in the city council at that point. And so the trade unionists who were very much in support of George were very nervous about doing this because they thought that they would not be able to win that argument, that the racism would just be too rampant. So what we did was through their trade union, the head of the trade union, I think his name was Barry Gill, he was a great guy. We went and visited every single Direct Works depot. I think it was something like 56 of them. We did 56 meetings. The very first meeting we went to, and this was the salient lesson that we learned very quickly. The trade union officials got up and spoke about George being under threat for deportation. And the first question that was asked by this guy who was deeply racist. He came out with the most incredible stuff. He just said, why should we defend these black people? They breed like monkeys or rabbits or something, and I wouldn't mind going to the Seychelles. So why you want to oppose your deportation? This kind of stuff. And what was interesting was that this guy felt confident enough to get up in front of his fellow workers and make this kind of really disgusting, disparaging remarks. And when we confronted that and we started arguing, the officials realized there's no way you can avoid the issue of racism here. We understood that to get solidarity, we weren't saying, oh, you should be sympathetic to George and his family. And of course, there was a real human side to all of this, which was very important. But we were saying, listen, guys, this is in your self-interest to take this stand, because by defending George, you're actually standing up for yourself. We won every single meeting. We insisted, and we were the ones that instigated this, that every meeting should end in a vote. People had to physically say where they stood. And what happened was that the shop stewards who were with us, who had been involved, who had been reluctant and nervous about this because they feared the racism, what happened was that the racists became isolated. What the vote was for was that we wanted, in the run-up to George's hearing with the immigration officials, we wanted to organise a demonstration in Manchester of the Direct Works Department marching in support of a black deportee, which is what that picture is about. That picture is a young man that I hardly recognise. That picture is of us, George and his wife and myself, leading this demonstration, and there are 1,500 Direct Works workers in overalls and everything, who came out on strike to support George on that day. And it was the most exhilarating experience, because to be walking through the streets of Manchester and looking behind us, seeing 1,500 majority white working class people supporting with a banner that said no to deportations was just fantastic. It had never been done before, and we felt rightly proud. You know, we really worked incredibly hard to get there, but that demonstration was cited in the evidence that the immigration department gave when they agreed that George would stay in the country. They actually referred to the fact that this had taken place. So it made a huge impact, and it really showed that you could get results. The workers in Manchester, from then onwards, they realised through collective action they could actually achieve things. They started to believe that they had the capacity to make things happen. It just showed to us that you could win the argument with British workers, that they were not born racist, they were not irredeemably, beyond the pale, that you couldn't reason with them, that they were just these, xenophobic nationalists, backward or whatever. But actually, when you put the argument to them and you were prepared to stand and confront them, and not just confront them, but actually listen to what they were saying and put a counterpoint to that they were rational, that they could be convinced, that they could be won over, and that when you have that, then you have the power of people.
One very good example of a campaign for solidarity that I think was a demonstration of solidarity that I was involved in many, many years ago now, when I was much, much younger. A number of people in Birmingham, where I was living at the time, would actually go and make visits to asylum seekers in Winson Green prison. I might be a white teenage girl, in Birmingham, a million miles away from somebody who's just come here from Afghanistan. But I think going to visit those men in Winson Green prison was a really important symbol of solidarity that transcended, class, race, ethnicity, gender, everything, age. And yeah, it was very important for those people in prison, I think, to know that people on the outside, people not in the prison, were actually supporting them. And I think even just the fact that it showed we knew that they still existed, that we knew they were alive, we knew they were there. I think that was a very important expression of solidarity.
I do remember very, very vividly instances in the 80s where white people came to the defence of black people. For example, I was a student at Newcastle Polytechnic. Now, the National Front were never going to be a huge electoral, party. And in Newcastle at that time, as it happens, there were fairly regular National Front marches. Now, there was Workers Against Racism that I was part of, and there were other groups, say, for example, like the Anti-Nazi League, but their focus was much more to call for people to be banned. Now, Workers Against Racism never did that, and they organised counter marches. The more important thing, I would argue, was in developing the ideas, political ideas of why white people should take a stand with black people. That work was pretty invaluable because it meant that black and white could unite as equals, not as somebody that needed like a helping hand because they couldn't do it for themselves.
Cherry Groce's name is etched into the history of Brixton. She was crippled by a police bullet in 1985. An inspector shot Mrs. Groce by accident when entering a bedroom. Riots erupted and the area was again in flames for the second time in 4 years.
The kind of racism that existed in the 80s, the racism that, if you like, was an official or semi-official policy in institutions. I mean, not every institution, but certainly the police, for example, housing, for example. That I really don't think exists, or at least it doesn't exist on the scale that it did before. Most people just genuinely don't really think that much about race. They're not that bothered by it, They don't really think, they They're not bothered if their children marry across ethnic lines. They're not bothered if the Prime Minister isn't white. And they don't think you have to be white to be English either, as it happens. So for me, those are signs of the kind of progress that has been made, because that's a very easy, spontaneous tolerance and acceptance.
We're at Cap House Colliery at Wakefield. 40 years ago, there were about 180,000 miners working in 175 pits across Britain. Today, there's virtually nothing left of the industry, apart from museums like this one. But back then, it was the livelihood for tens of thousands of families. Sometimes whole towns and villages depended on the pit for a living.
Between 1974 and 1983, some 60,000 miners lost their jobs. 36 pits closed between 74 and 79. 28 closed between 79 and 84. So you can see there's a dramatic attack on working class people's living standards.
So it was no surprise when in 1984, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced the closure of 20 pits and the loss of 20,000 jobs, that it sparked the biggest industrial dispute in British history.
She was very determined to set out to use whatever force was required to attack the miners' strike, and very much provoked it in the way that she referred to the miners, for example, as the enemy within, drawing on the relationship that the 82 Falklands War, the Argentinians were the enemy without, and she made a kind of parallel comparison as if these miners were sort of very anti-British in their whole approach.
The Thatcher government set out to break the power of the traditional labour movement, starting when it was strongest, with the National Union of Mine Workers. What began as a walkout over jobs at one colliery began a year-long political struggle between the state and the organised working class. I was only at primary school at the time, but with me here is Dave, who was an activist during the strike.
In 1984, I was working in Leeds in a computer centre. I was a member of a trade union, and I was already politically active. But when the strike started, my first thoughts were, how do we get to the picket lines? The first things we were doing was driving across from Yorkshire to Nottingham to get through the police lines. When that didn't seem possible because of all the problems of getting through to Nottingham, we started to spread the strike towards other areas like the power stations in West Yorkshire. So we got involved with something like power station workers, taking pickets to the Egborough power station near here. But what was pretty obvious to me was there was a massive amount of support for the miners right across the country, but it wasn't being tapped. Solidarity was channeled into a very kind of charitable approach towards the strike, rather than a solidarity approach where we would go to other trade unions to bring other trade union members into the strike. And I think that was the victory of the 1970s, where the trade union movement could use all of its muscles across several different industries in order to bring the Heath government down. That didn't happen in 1984.
The National Coal Board has to close uneconomic pits. It always has.
But if the mine is not productive and the jobs are gone, then the people, what do they live on? How do they survive? How do they feed their families? And so, the fact of the matter is that defending working class people's lives and living standards requires a movement that says, well, that's not our problem. Our problem is the people we represent and their lives and their living standards and their mortgages and their families and their education and their future. And if this mine has to close, you have to provide us with alternative jobs, paying equally or better so that we can sustain our lives and our living standards. And that should be the very basic aspect of what a trade union should do. But unfortunately, they are far removed from that.
The trouble was the miners saw their role as defending the mining industry, and what it really needed was that broader understanding that it was the working class which had to fight together, that we all had a common interest.
The Plan for Coal, which was an initiative organised by the pits and the management of the mines, along with the trade union movement and the government. And the Plan for Coal was a way of making each mine or each pit a separate entity involved in negotiating its own wage levels, its own productivity levels and so forth. So that had the effect of separating each mine from each other. And sort of we're very productive mine with higher wages, we're a lower productive mine with lower wages, and we've got to fight our battles on our own and you fight your battles on your own. And that was why the Nottinghamshire miners, for example, had a very different relationship to the NUM than some other, to the National Union, than others. And so there was a kind of sense of we solve our problems, we solve our problems. And the difficulty of bringing the whole union into one focused determination to win this struggle was reflected in the fact that the Nottinghamshire miners never striked in the first place and everybody else was striking. And the trade union leadership of the National Union of Mine Workers failed utterly to win over the massive miners. Remember, the miners amounted to something like 185,000 people, almost double the number of police that were available to police the strike.
Listen to me, it's my intention to arrest you should you fail to turn around.
Well, you'll have to take me then. No.
Oh, he can't drive!
No, man.
I'll take his car.
Oh, how are we going on?
In front of our camera, the police then took the keys of the vehicle and formally arrested the driver who had refused to turn back.
Do you think the government had a better sense of that wider struggle?
I think the Tories are 2 steps ahead of the trade union movement all the time, and they were fully prepared to win this battle. They had the police all ready to stop the pickets going across the border. They had stockpiles of coal. They were really prepared, and we all know that if things had got worse, they would have brought the army in. And so I think there were over 11,000 miners arrested during the miners' strike, 100 of which went to prison. They were determined to crush the power of organised labour, and the trade union movement had learnt nothing from 1974.
There is no precedent for the way the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher responded to the strike. You have to go back to 1926 or even before the First World War to see the levels of state coercion that were involved. And back then they used to use the military. 20,000 police were drafted into the coalfields. Every aspect of the state, special branch, MI5, riot squads, agent provocateurs, spies, mass arrests, stopping coaches in Kent from trying to get to the coalfields, the judiciary and the courts sentencing them to significant prison sentences, the sequestration of trade union funds wherever they could get hold of it. It was clear there was going to be no negotiations.
What we're doing is stopping people on the road, and we are, if you want to look at it, in total isolation and infringement of civil liberties. But let's look at what we are trying to do.
Very quickly, we were stopped on the motorways, so we used to find all the back roads to get through to Nottingham. And when the police blocked those off, we had to find new ways of getting through to get to the picket lines in Nottingham. So once we organised a minibus, and we recruited loads of women, female students from Leeds University, and we went through the police lines because the police were so sexist. They didn't actually think women would go to the picket lines. So that morning, I arrived with 12 women at a Nottingham pit, and we were the only pickets who got through that day. Other things we did during the miners' strike, we did a lot of collecting money for the pits around West Yorkshire. And again, the police were very involved in that. We were arrested several times for collecting money or putting posters up on bus shelters in support of the miners' strike. The police were pretty geared up from the outset.
We kept the men and the families from starving because they wanted to starve us, so we go back to work. But people didn't starve because we worked hard to put food on the table for them. We worked really hard. There were soup kitchens, so you could get a meal there if you wanted one. Children had a meal every day at school, so we knew they were fed. And our group did parcels. We're thinking a woman, she'd be around knocking on doors and saying, look, we're doing parcels, are you on strike? It's something for you if you need it. She told me she came across this man and he just come to the door, and she said he just broke down and cried. His wife had left him because he was on strike and he would go back. She just left him with 2 kids, and he said, with nothing to eat. The cute, you know, and just to come across somebody like that, stop them going back, it meant a lot. I was in Browns at the time, and I had my badge, my hospitality badge it was, for making tea, cups of tea and coffee on the picket line, the miners on the, you know, the oil can filled up with the coal.
The miners weren't getting any strike pay through the miners' strike, so they had nothing, literally nothing, and money and food and other support was really important.
So what was it like being a woman of colour supporting a white male-dominated cause?
It was to be free of those categories. I felt I was a person showing solidarity. It was freedom, a little moment of freedom through solidarity. It was pretty close to a civil war, you know, roads were closed, the police were ordered to close down motorways. All that ranged against them. Public solidarity was enormously important.
Well, the miners enjoyed quite incredible support across the country. You know, there was a huge amount of working class solidarity taking shape in many different forms. Other workers at, you know, different facilities, like, for example, steel production, which relied heavily on coal, or electricity production, which relied heavily on coal. There were workers in those areas who were quite prepared to take what we call secondary action in support of the miners, in terms of not breaking picket lines. If one was established, say, at a steel yard in support of the miners, other workers wouldn't cross the picket line to go to work. And that was a generalized outlook throughout the kind of rank and file of the trade union movement. But I'm afraid the kind of activity and behavior of the trade union leadership across many of these other unions was one of restricting or redirecting or finding ways to limit the activity of their members, building a sense of fear about the viability of their own jobs, about possibilities of repercussions for the trade union. So trade unions were very afraid that if they broke the law, or if they got involved in secondary action, or if the courts acted against them, their funds and everything else could easily be found and extracted and taken away. And so they were very worried about the viability of their own unions.
It's hard for us to understand today how much that conflict just shook society and gave people the impression that there was a real war going on, and just the real impact it had on society.
The end result was this area around here was, massively, it's decimated the industries around here. It was a huge defeat for the working class when the miners lost. And I don't think that the working class movement's ever recovered for that, really, to this point. I think the end of the miners' strike is the end of an era in British political history. There's no doubt about it. It was the crushing of the mine workers, who were seen as the crack troops of the trade union movement. It was a huge defeat, a defeat that they've never recovered from. And I think it's a watershed in British politics. It's never been the same since. Britain's a very, very different place from the 1980s.
It's been 32 years since official independence of Ukraine was recognized by the entire world, but yet Ukraine is still fighting for its independence. We're still here and we're still trying to ensure that our independence, our freedom and our democracy are protected.
When Russia first invaded Ukraine, I think there was a very genuine sense of outrage that Russia had done this, and worry about what's happening to these people who are losing their lives and their homes and being driven out of their country. The forms that took in terms of wanting to provide humanitarian relief, wanting to offer homes to refugees, I think that was a very positive human expression. As time has gone on, I think it's become more complicated because Ukraine isn't a natural disaster, and yet the response to the war treated it almost as though it was a natural disaster. The response was driven by a kind of a pity for the victims of the war, and sometimes what we might call virtue signalling that took place, quite an empty way. I'm a nice person, I support Ukraine. When you see the discussion as time has moved on, it's become quite difficult because I think a lot of people don't really understand or agree with the principle of national sovereignty. They're comfortable in thinking that Russia's a bad guy. They're not really comfortable in articulating why it's so important that you have borders around your country and people shouldn't be able to invade you. And they don't have a sense of why you'd fight for your own country, let alone, in solidarity with someone else. So that's why I think the Ukraine cause has become so confused amongst a lot of people in surrounding countries.
What was your reaction when there was a full-blown invasion?
For me, it was disbelief, really.
I was in Moscow at the day when the war started, and I had a flight early in the morning. I was going from Moscow back to London, basically, and I heard on the radio about the invasion. I was shocked, and I thought I'm not gonna go back because they will cancel the flight. So I was very afraid that, that's the end. They are closing the country. It's back to the Soviets again.
Yeah. Like, I had this hope that clearly people understand. Clearly they know this is wrong. This is not a debate. One country invaded another country and killing its people.
Yeah, and we're the invaders.
And my people are the invaders, as much as I don't want to call them that, they are.
Yeah, but I think we do have a certain cultural, being apolitical,
Yes.
People in our generation.
Yeah.
When people decide not to go and protest, they say, oh yeah, but if something changes, it's not going to get better. It will just get worse.
I feel like that's not even about protest. I think everyone in Russia has that sort of a protest is useless. It's a useless thing because if you go to protest, you're going to get arrested. You might get tortured by the police, or maybe they'll torture you to admit to crimes of terrorism, and then you'll be sent to Siberia whilst you're a 19-year-old university student. The only thing that protests in Russia really achieve is showing to the media outside of Russia that people do not agree with this regime.
So how do Russians actually explain to themselves what's going on? Do they use NATO as a justification for the invasion?
NATO is a continuation of this evil Western enemy.
Yes.
Of
you are very
the
right.
West. The America.
Yes, the enemy.
That's been so evil and poisonous to every single Russian since they were born.
We don't know what general public thinks because, first of all, we don't have actual statistics to somehow be sure what the general public actually thinks.
It's only censorship.
It's only censorship,
Only censorship. There's nothing else but censorship. You never trust anything that you see from any media. Even that they're not state-backed, that someone from the state is threatening them to reflect the same opinions as the state demands.
Right.
So you cannot be a journalist in Russia with integrity. I think Putin is a big fan of Stalinism and a big fan of Stalin, and he really thinks that fear is the best tool
to stay in power.
Stay in power and control people. And he's not totally wrong.
Is he wrong? Yeah.
Right now, it's obviously very, I think, admirable, the spirit of the Ukrainian people. People who I've encountered, especially women, either sons or husbands or nephews, they had the opportunity to leave the country when it's incredibly dangerous, but they refuse to leave.
Particularly from the front lines.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And they volunteer to go and they want to protect their homeland. And they refuse to run away.
A lot of the Russian army is people from prisons, murderers, and
and they promise freedom if they come back alive.
Wow.
They get full pardon.
It's not just about putting Ukrainian flags on your accounts on Facebook, Twitter and stuff. It's about donating to Ukraine. Doesn't matter whether it's humanitarian or military, but for me solidarity means donating and helping Ukraine physically, not just saying, well, I stand with Ukraine.
When solidarity is just a question of flying the right flag for a few weeks whilst it's quite a trendy thing to do, or when it's an internet meme that you share or a sticker that you put on your profile. You know, that doesn't really help the people in Ukraine. I'm sure they're not going to bed at night kind of thinking, oh, well, you know, we can rest assured. Joanna's put a little Ukrainian flag on her Twitter profile, everything's going to be okay. Whereas what really helps them in their fight against the Russian invasion is to have weapons, you know, is to have arms so that they can then defend themselves. And it's important that the West does step up and play that role, but we do provide these weapons because, like I say, it'll be our national sovereignty tomorrow. That becomes rendered meaningless when it's something that can be so easily given away.
NATO is very, very pro-Ukraine. We are not squeamish about lethal aid. So when Ukraine wanted to make a prototype kamikaze naval drone to essentially fight off the Black Sea Fleet, they struggled to get the funding to develop this, so they came to NATO and said, could you raise $250,000 so we can make a prototype kamikaze naval drone? And we said, absolutely, you just have to let us choose the name for it, because that will help us get people invested in buying, raising money for these naval drones.
Were you involved in when you heard about the invasion?
So there were protests happening since day one, I think. So I got back to London on the 24th, and I think on the 25th we were already on the streets. So the girls did really nice little banners, and we went to the protests, and we went there every single day that we could. So I think, and we were trying to post everywhere on all social media every single day. I think a couple of weeks into the war, Russian government started to block all of these posts, and they
banned Instagram.
They would introduce this law that Instagram and Facebook is a terrorist organization. So Russian people would not be able to see that kind of posts, and they would not be able to post themselves as well.
We organized like a donation point where basically, you know, I just asked my friends, like everyone kind of like just make your Amazon orders. Like this is kind of what we need. And then we would kind of collect it also together. Like a lot of friends came to help, and we would send it to kind of donation centers. There's a very limited amount of things that Ukraine actually really, really needed.
Yeah.
So it was great that we could kind of pull that information and make sure that we're sending what really was needed.
A couple of months later, I gave up my Russian citizenship because, you know, you can argue as much as you want. You can explain to people that, oh, you know, I don't support this. But I understood that if I have this opportunity, I'm going to take it. You know, when they hear that I'm from Russia, they try to sympathize for the very wrong reasons, as in that, you know, well, it's not so black and white. You know, the Ukrainians shouldn't be fighting. The Ukrainians should accept all of these peace agreements and all of these division of their country, which I think would be a very, very big mistake. And it will be a very big mistake not only for Ukraine, but for the whole Europe, for the whole world, basically, because it will set up a very, very bad precedent that, you know, someone can just go and take a piece from your country, and you should just accept it because this someone is stronger than you, and they have more military, and they have more weapons, and they have more money. This is the reason why I think we should all continue sending weapons to Ukraine, and the West should continue that.
I mean,
because they need help, and they don't just need, first aid kits and food and I don't know, tampons, prayers and tampons.
Lots of prayers.
They need weapons, and they need money, and they need actual help.
So choosing to give up your Russian citizenship, that's quite an act of solidarity, and I think it's a pretty inspiring thing to do. Like, what did your friends and family make of that?
Well, first of all, I need to say that I was in a very privileged position to be able to do that in the first place. I had a double citizenship, so you cannot just give up your passport if you have just one of these. So, of course, it's not possible. But for me, it was still a very tough decision because my family, my mother, my grandmother, they're still in Russia. And I'm not able to visit them now, or if it continues as it is right now in the future as well, because of course no one's going to give me a Russian visa now. But to be honest, I wouldn't expect other people to do the same thing as well if they have just one passport, which is why, yes, I don't want to sound more noble than I actually am. Yes, I haven't seen my mom in 2 years, so my grandfather died in May. I didn't have a chance to say goodbye. I didn't have a chance to go to the funeral, but it is what it is. It's life. And I still think that I made the right choice. And my mom was very angry with me at first. She thought that it's, It's this unnecessary thing that could be avoided, but I don't think so. I think it was the right decision. Because otherwise, someone can always come up to you and say, oh, but you're Russian, it's happening in your name. And they wouldn't be completely wrong. Because did I go back to Russia to protest? I didn't. I protested here in a safe space. So they would be completely, not completely, but they would have sense in that.
So you said that you didn't think it was wise to go back to Russia and protest from there. Do you know of any instances where people have been punished or sort of, otherwise maybe even imprisoned for speaking out against this?
Of course. It's right now it's a 10-year sentence. It's still happening all over Russia. It's happening even in very distant areas and neighborhoods where mothers are being taken from their children because they post something or they say something out loud in their workspace, and their colleagues just they write a letter to the mayor and they say, oh, this person is inciting to terrorism, because it's called terrorism now. Protesting is called terrorism now. We always knew that it's a Ukrainian territory, and it doesn't matter how many people speak Russian there and how many Russians are there. It's a territory of a sovereign country, which is different from ours. And also I would say that many Ukrainian people, not even in Donetsk, everywhere, they do speak Russian. And so what? It doesn't matter. It is true that Ukraine tried to reduce the Russian influence in these territories. This is true. But all of these stories, they were so ridiculously exaggerated just to serve the cause, and the cause is for Putin and his friends to stay in power.
So a lot of the common sentiment that I hear at the time is that there's this fear of consequences to Western support, the British government getting too involved with this. There's a fear of escalation, as they say, or nuclear war. Do you say that that's legitimate at all? And if it is are there some things that are worth dying for?
It is legitimate, and it is something to be afraid of. It's possible, for sure. But this is not an excuse to allow this to continue, and this is not an excuse to allow Putin to take their land. We can't allow him to have his way. That's the most important thing. We can't allow him to take Ukrainians' territories.
As much as it is a fight and a war about Ukrainian liberation, it is also about setting a precedent. You cannot do things like this. And I do think that it is something worth dying for. Because if we're not willing to die for this, if we are willing to say, well, this is actually not our problem, we've got our own living crisis happening in our country, you guys figure it out yourselves, the consequences of your inaction can be absolutely catastrophic.
Is democracy worth dying for? Is having a free world worth dying for?
Absolutely.
Then here's your answer. And I'm proud that this is the country I decided to move to.
Yes.
But you cannot claim to be a leading democratic power and don't think this is your fight.
It says, why do we need to die for freedom? Do you think it's worth dying for, freedom?
In our case, we must, because we don't have another way, unfortunately.
What about the claims that this isn't a war about freedom, but it's actually a proxy war, like for the benefit of the Western world?
Maybe there's some kind of political motivation from every side, and it's always been like that. It's normal, and it's also reality and real world. But what we have now is we have Ukraine fighting for their freedom, and we should support them in that, and we should help them. That's what I think.
I'm proud of the fact the British people will offer solidarity to other people. That's my patriotism. It's not God save the King. It's I will help my brothers and sisters in another country in their hour of need. So I think it's a great tradition in British history of solidarity. I think the British government, they were the first actually to give them their due. I'm not on their team. They gave arms to Ukraine and led the way. And I think that's excellent. I think we should continue to do that. I just hope that the Ukrainian people win and are able to become a sovereign nation, and whether or not they vote for the government or the kind of government that I'd vote for, that's up to them. They should have the freedom to decide what kind of politicians they want in power and not have it imposed upon them by an outside force.
України ні слава, ні воля, ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші воріжень, як роса на сонці, запануєм і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці.